What was it like to live during the Great Depression in the U.S.? If the vibrant 1920s were likened to an endless, extravagant party, then the Great Depression was the ultimate hangover. Everything collapsed after Black Tuesday on October 29, 1929, when billions of dollars invested in the stock market were wiped out in a single day, ushering in the prolonged Great Depression. Today, let's explore what life was truly like when a quarter of the workforce lost their jobs, and even those fortunate enough to be employed saw their incomes plummet dramatically. The shock and initial impact on daily life. Before the dark curtain of the Great Depression fell, the dazzling 1920s, known as the Roaring Twenties, were an unprecedented boom period in U.S. history. World War I, a bloody conflict still remembered by many Americans, seemed to have passed through the U.S. without leaving too many scars. Thanks to its favorable geographical location, far from the European-Asian battlefields, the U.S. remained almost untouched, even growing wealthier by selling weapons and goods to warring parties. The American economy entered a period of unprecedented prosperity, becoming the wealthiest in the world. By 1925, half of American households had electricity, and new home appliances like refrigerators began appearing on the market, significantly raising people's living standards. The U.S. became the world's largest creditor, holding over 60% of total international debt from 1924 to 1931, with Germany as the largest debtor, accounting for 40%. This international lending boosted the global standing of the USD. However, beneath this bright picture lay potentially risky decisions. The U.S. Federal Reserve, FED, lowered interest rates to stimulate production consumption and both domestic and international investment. This led to an insane increase in money supply. Approximately $28 billion was added to the economy by the FED from 1921 to 1927, equivalent to an over 60% increase in circulating money. When the Fed noticed excessive speculation, meaning investments in the stock market were not creating corresponding real value, they attempted to control it by raising interest rates from 3.5% to 5% in 1928. However, this monetary tightening policy backfired in an unpredictable way. The interest rate hike increased borrowing costs from banks, but prompted non-bank entities like investment funds and businesses to directly provide capital to Wall Street speculators, as the interest rates there were significantly higher than foreign bonds. This pulled a large amount of capital from abroad back to the U.S., weakening other nations' access to capital needed for post-war reconstruction or debt repayment. The surge in the Dow Jones Industrial Average after 1928 indicated that the financial bubble had grown too large and was ready for a crisis. By 1929, the economic reality began to show alarming signs. Production stagnated, and supply far exceeded demand. Major corporations like General Motors in the automotive industry, Woolworth in retail, and U.S. Steel in steel all reported revenues ranging from break-even to losses, indicating a general stagnation across all sectors due to weak consumer spending, which did not match the volume of products and services the American economic machine was generating. When market confidence in companies declined, investors panicked and began to sell off stocks en masse to preserve profits. The climax was Black Thursday, October 24, 1929, when over 12.8 million shares were sold in a single day, 3 times the usual trading volume. This was followed by Black Monday, October 28, 1929, when the Dow Jones Index dropped 12.8%, an unprecedented decline in its history. The situation continued into the next day, with the market recording an additional 11.7% drop. Although the Wall Street crash is often considered the beginning of the Great Depression, many economists argue that it was merely one of the inevitable consequences of the capitalist production race, leading to oversupply and deflation. Widespread economic impact. Life plunges into chaos. After the dark days on the stock market, the United States plunged into one of the most prolonged and severe economic crises in its history. The crisis quickly spread, with a quarter of the American workforce losing their jobs in the first 4 years, meaning approximately 13 million people were unemployed by the time President Franklin D. Roosevelt took office. Long lines of people waiting for bread distribution were a common sight in most cities, and hundreds of thousands wandered across the country in search of food, work, and shelter. Even those fortunate enough to be employed saw their incomes drop by up to 40%. Wages and working hours were cut, forcing families to cut spending in many ways. From 1929 to 1932, industrial output decreased by nearly 45% and residential construction by 80%. One of the most direct and severe impacts was the collapse of the banking system. The early 1930s saw the collapse of about 9,000 banks, equivalent to 1/7 of the total national deposits and more than half of the financial system at the time. Approximately 5,000 banks ceased operations from 1929 to 1932, and by 1933, 11,000 out of 25,000 U.S. banks had failed. Major banks like Carwell National Federal Bank in the South and Bank of United States in New York also collapsed, causing people to almost completely lose trust in the U.S. financial system. This collapse was directly influenced by how the federal banking system leadership implemented policies. The U.S. money reserve model at the time did not allow non-member banks of the federal system to access funds from the Fed, making local and agent banks vulnerable to collapse when people rushed to withdraw money. Additionally, the U.S. self-destructed on the international trade front. President Herbert Hoover, who took office in 1929, faced this terrible crisis. Although he tried to control the national financial situation, his policies were ineffective. One such policy was the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. Despite pleas from over 1,000 American economists, this act increased tariffs on more than 20,000 types of imported goods, causing their prices to soar. Initially, the purpose was to protect domestic production, but it made goods expensive and businesses lacked raw materials. As a result, at least 25 countries, including Canada, Germany, and the UK, retaliated with their own tariffs, isolating the U.S. in the international market. U.S. exports plummeted from $7 billion US 1929 to $2.5 billion US 1932, while imports nearly tripled, falling from $5.9 billion US to $2 billion US during the same period. Global trade became stagnant, with losses reaching up to 65% between 1929 and 1934. As the fear of the crisis subsided, new needs emerged. People were forced to return to a more frugal lifestyle, which deeply affected the population, as memories of World War I and the Spanish flu pandemic were still fresh in many minds. From 1929 to 1933, U.S. GDP decreased by about 30%, and the stock market lost nearly 90% of its value. Adapting to hardship. In the context of extreme economic hardship, Americans were forced to cut spending as much as possible, especially on food. Daily meals had to be stretched to their absolute limit, leading to the popularity of inexpensive yet nutritious dishes to sustain life. Very basic cornbread became a familiar staple on many family tables, along with mac and cheese, baked beans, and potato soup. Even fashion magazines at the time shifted their focus, publishing budget-saving food tips with recipes for stews and chili, reflecting a frugal lifestyle that society as a whole had to adapt to. The need for food during this difficult period recalled experiences from World War I, when the National War Garden Commission encouraged people to grow fruits and vegetables at home to contribute to the war effort and ensure food supply. Now, During the Great Depression, people also readopted this practice, creating home gardens whenever possible, and some towns even allowed vacant lots to be converted into community gardens, where everyone worked together to grow and share the produce. As economic resources dwindled, social activities were among the first things to be cut. In the first 5 years of the Great Depression, more than a third of American movie theaters closed. To cope with this situation, free or low-cost forms of entertainment became popular and bonded communities more than ever. Church-organized potluck parties became free social events where people came not only to eat, but also to meet and share. Board games and card games brought people closer, with neighbors gathering to play cards and other games. Mini-golf was particularly popular as a cost-effective pastime, and over 30,000 mini-golf courses were established in the 1930s. Listening to the radio became a widespread habit, providing a way to keep up with the news, but more importantly, it was a form of escape from harsh reality. People listened to sports matches, comedy shows, and soap operas, finding comfort and entertainment in the stories and sounds emanating from the radio. Music during this period was also a powerful source of release and hopeful inspiration. Genres like jazz, swing, and big band became popular, enjoyed for dancing and listening, bringing a bit of joy and optimism amidst worries. Do you remember any childhood foods your family had to stretch to get through difficult times? Share your memories in the comments. New roles for women. Despite severe unemployment, a notable phenomenon occurred. Many women joined the workforce more than before. They took on jobs considered suitable for women at the time, such as secretaries, nurses, telephone operators, and teachers. However, women's participation in the labor market also faced significant pressure and criticism. Although these professions were not considered acceptable for men, some criticized women for taking jobs when so many men were unemployed and seeking opportunities. Some cities even refused to allow married women to become school teachers, believing these women would not face the same financial difficulties as men. But the harsh reality was that employers could pay women lower wages, which helped them reduce personnel costs in a stagnant economy. Women, whether employed or not, bore a heavy burden in managing family budgets. They had to find every way to patch old clothes, cook as economically as possible, and strictly manage food purchases. Dietary cuts, especially the lack of milk and essential foods, had severe consequences for growing children, leading to an increase in cases of rickets and diet-related illnesses. Education was also severely affected. Schools closed due to declining tax revenues, and thousands of children were deprived of education. Many of these children were forced to work in sweatshops and unregulated workplaces, where working conditions were extremely harsh. Homelessness and psychological burden. The Great Depression not only stripped millions of people of their jobs and possessions, but also left a deep psychological burden, completely changing society's view of poverty and assistance. Before the Great Depression, receiving social welfare was something many families tried to avoid at all costs due to the heavy stigma associated with it. Although this perception changed somewhat in the 1930s, for families who had to receive welfare, it was still a humiliating situation. Eileen Barth, a government social worker in Chicago, whose job was to assess the financial situation of aid applicants, including checking how many clothes they owned, recalled once having to ask an unemployed man who used to work in the railroad industry to let her look into his closet. She recounted, "I could see he was a very proud man. He was terribly humiliated. This humiliation was too much for some to bear." Another survivor, named Virginia Durr, recalled, "Proud people were shocked and went into mental hospitals. My mother was one of them." The psychological burden of the Great Depression ravaged people's spirits terribly. The national suicide rate sharply increased in 1933. Family life became strained, with divorce rates decreasing but family desertion rates increasing. Men, feeling ashamed and losing their masculinity when unable to provide for their families, left in despair. Approximately 300,000 people, mainly men, became homeless, also known as hobos. They hitchhiked on freight trains, slept under bridges, or went to shelters in big cities. This life on the rails was not as romantic as imagined. From 1929 to 1939, nearly 25,000 illegal riders were killed on railroad property. Many of these wanderers were also arrested and imprisoned. This psychological impact was exacerbated by media reports of violent crime, such as Bonnie and Clyde's bank robberies, or the kidnapping and murder of Charles Lindbergh's son. However, in reality, although violent crime did increase in the first few years, it sharply declined after 1934 and continued to decrease until the 1960s. Fear and despair gripped society, creating a gloomy and unstable atmosphere. Among these stories, what shocked or haunted you the most about the mental burden Americans endured? Share your thoughts below. Environmental disaster. The Dust Bowl. As the economic storm raged, another kind of storm devastated American farming communities. Severe drought struck the Plain States throughout the 1930s. Crops failed, and farms were destroyed, exposing overplowed lands. Dry soil, previously held in place by native plant roots, now began to be carried away by the wind. Strong winds and massive dust storms swept across the region, causing terrible destruction and turning the area into a dusty land. This environmental disaster exacerbated the already dire economic catastrophe. If farmers could grow any crops, they had to be sold at prices so low that families could not survive. Rented farms were foreclosed, and many farmers were forced to leave their homes and migrate to California, hoping to become seasonal laborers, where they had to compete for meager-paying agricultural jobs. By 1940, about 65,000 people had migrated from Nebraska during what was called the Dirty 30s. In total, approximately 2.5 million people left the Plain States, forming the largest migration in U.S. history. The climate of the Great Plains was already unpredictable, but the 1930s brought unprecedented weather conditions. For example, in 1934, Nebraska experienced more than 20 days with temperatures above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, approximately 38 degrees Celsius. The following years brought continuous dust storms, floods, and other heat waves. Those who remained in the plains endured incessant dust storms blowing through their towns. The dust killed crops, obscured the sun, and was everywhere, even seeping into homes. People had to hang damp bed sheets to keep out the dust, tape windows shut, and invert cups and glasses until used to avoid dust. Even so, hardship bred humor. Farmers often joked that a man hit by a raindrop had to be revived by having 2 buckets of sand thrown in his face. Some local stores even advertised sarcastically, "Great deal on real estate, bring your own container," implying there was so much dust you could literally take the land with you. Government policy, AAA. With the agricultural economy in severe decline by the spring of 1933, proponents of the New Deal had grounds to test their belief that greater regulation would solve the nation's problems. This led to a controversial decision by President Franklin D. Roosevelt, the establishment of the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, AAA, in 1933. In the government's view, the main problem was that agricultural products were selling too cheaply, undermining the entire economy. They believed that surplus crops and livestock contributed to low prices. Therefore, to balance supply and demand and raise agricultural prices, the government introduced a bold policy, paying farmers to leave a portion of their land idle and produce fewer crops and livestock. The funds for these subsidies came from taxes levied on agricultural processing industries. This activity began in the spring, and many farmers in the Midwest benefited from this system. The Commodity Credit Corporation was also established to buy and store agricultural products to reduce market supply and drive up prices. However, this policy created a painful paradox. While these farmers grew less food and received subsidies to drive up commodity prices, many other Americans could not feed themselves or their families due to rising prices and widespread unemployment. Moreover, it encouraged landowners not to cultivate land, dismissing tenant farmers and sharecroppers, contributing to the migration flow. The 8AA was struck down by the Supreme Court in 1936 because the taxes levied on food processing companies were deemed unconstitutional. However, Congress quickly passed another law to support farmers, allowing the government to subsidize farmers who agreed to leave land unplanted for conservation purposes. By 1938, with a New Deal supporting majority on the Supreme Court, Congress reinstated the AAA. Despite its reinstatement, this policy and subsequent programs primarily benefited larger, more productive farms. Small farms and tenant farmers could not compete effectively, forcing many farmers to migrate from rural areas to cities or abandon their small farms to work on larger ones. By 1940, nearly 6 million farmers had received federal subsidies. Paradoxical health outcomes. Incredibly, despite all the suffering, widespread hunger, and homelessness, the Great Depression reduced most mortality rates in the U.S., except for suicide. This is a phenomenon that researchers have struggled to explain. Other causes of death, including traffic accidents, tuberculosis, pneumonia, and influenza, significantly decreased. Mortality rates for cardiovascular and kidney diseases also stabilized in the first few years of the Depression. Even more astonishing, the average life expectancy for white people actually increased by 6 years from 1929 to 1933. For people of color, although their life expectancy was lower during the Depression, it increased faster by about 8 years. In total, life expectancy rose from about 57 years in 1929 to 63 years in 1933. Researchers speculate that the cause of this paradoxical phenomenon might be higher smoking rates during economic booms. When the economy is strong, the pace of life is also faster, causing more stress and less sleep for people, which can negatively affect health. Conversely, during economic downturns, the pace of life slows down. People may experience less stress and get more sleep. This suggests a thought-provoking truth. Economic expansion can sometimes be more detrimental to health than economic recession. What do you think really created this health paradox during the Great Depression? Could a slower pace of life genuinely be better for us? Comment below. Community and resilience. Overall, life during the Great Depression was as diverse and paradoxical as society is today. While some could still find joy in simple pastimes like mini-golf and listening to the radio, others faced the harsh reality of having dust for dinner due to dust storms. Some families struggled to pay bills to keep their homes and cars, while others lost everything and were forced into homelessness, living in makeshift shanty towns. People endured hunger as the government paid farmers to grow less food for subsidies. However, throughout these struggles, a miracle occurred. Many people formed close-knit communities where they shared resources and helped each other overcome challenging times. This spirit of solidarity and sharing became a tremendous source of strength and resilience for many, shaping the attitudes and character of an entire generation of Americans. The Great Depression, a unique and unprecedented economic and financial event in U.S. and world history, is considered by many analysts to be a series of consecutive misguided decisions from the Federal Reserve, raising interest rates too soon, and the Hoover administration, labor and trade control policies. Fed leader Ben Bernanke later admitted the Federal Reserve's mistake in raising interest rates too soon, stating, "Regarding the Great Depression, you're right. We did it. We're very sorry. But thanks to you, we won't do it again." However, it was also thanks to this event that many things were revolutionized and positively changed during the post-crisis recovery period. President Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal introduced a series of laws and solutions to lift the U.S. out of the Great Depression. Important agencies were established to fill previous gaps, such as the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC, which insured people's deposits to regain public trust in banks. The Social Security system was also established through the Social Security Act of 1935, providing benefits to the elderly, disabled, and unemployed, becoming the largest domestic program managed by the U.S. government to this day. Franklin D. Roosevelt, who steered the sinking ship of the U.S. incredibly effectively during the rebuilding period, was elected the longest-serving and greatest president in U.S. history due to his ability to navigate the country through the crisis and mobilize forces to participate in World War II. Times create heroes, and the solidarity in neighborhoods brought strength and resilience to many, shaping the attitudes of an entire generation of Americans. The Great Depression is not just a tumultuous page in history, but also a testament to the resilient strength of humanity and the ability to find light in the darkest of times. Although those years were challenging, lessons about sharing, community, and adaptation remain valuable to this day. If you could go back in time to witness or experience one thing from the Great Depression, what would it be? 20 ways Americans had fun during the Great Depression. During a time when millions of Americans faced unemployment, crop failures, and even evictions, could joy possibly exist? The answer is yes. Despite all the hardships, Americans found unique and creative ways to entertain themselves and shake off daily worries. Today, we're going to look back at 20 ways Americans found joy during those challenging years. Let's begin this nostalgic journey. Watching dance marathons, where contestants danced until they dropped. Before reality TV existed, Americans flocked to dance marathons to watch strangers do unusual or dangerous things for money and attention. These competitions began in the 1920s as part of the endurance contest craze. However, when the Great Depression hit, dance marathons weren't just a form of entertainment for spectators. They became an escape, a glimmer of hope for the contestants themselves. For many participants, these contests were not only a physical challenge, but also a chance to get food, shelter, and an opportunity to win cash prizes. In a time when 15 million people couldn't find work, and millions struggled to survive. Having 12 meals a day at waist-high tables on the dance floor, along with 15-minute breaks every hour for a nurse to tend to or massage their feet, was an incredible luxury. Contestants had to keep moving for the remaining 45 minutes of each hour. Some even learned to sleep while their partners held them up and dragged them across the dance floor. If a sleeping dancer's knee touched the floor, the couple would be disqualified. For added safety, dancers sometimes tied their wrists behind their partners' necks before falling asleep. The physical danger of dance marathons was precisely why people paid to watch them. Audiences were captivated by the drama, the desperation, and the sheer grit of the contestants. Despite rumors of promoters cheating to favor certain couples, the sight of exhausted people collapsing into each other's arms at the 1934 walkathon in Washington remains a testament to their suffering and determination. By the late 1930s, these contests gradually faded due to increasing criticism and laws banning them in many parts of the country. However, during their toughest times, they provided both entertainment and a glimmer of hope for those fighting to survive. This shows that even in the darkest moments, the human spirit always finds a way to rise and seek a little bit of light. Indulging in the lives of the rich and famous, Cafe Society. One of the longest-standing traditions in American history is reading about the tumultuous lives of celebrities. For Americans during the Great Depression, this meant reading about Cafe Society. After Prohibition ended in 1933, former speakeasies in cities like New York transformed into glamorous restaurants and nightclubs, teeming with movie stars, musicians, wealthy individuals who hadn't lost all their money, social climbers trying to maintain their status, and plenty of gossip columnists to document what all these people were doing there. The super-wealthy Vanderbilts were a fantastic source of café society drama. Photographers followed the single Alfred Gwynne Vanderbilt, Jr., to nightclubs, capturing him dating a string of glamorous women. Meanwhile, gossip columnists worried about the supposedly decadent lifestyle of his half-sister, Gloria Mimi Baker, who frequented nightclubs and casinos at just 15 years old. Family dramas outside the club scene also made headlines. In 1934, newspaper readers were shocked by the sensational custody battle over 10-year-old Gloria Vanderbilt. Newspapers dubbed Gloria the poor little rich girl, a moniker they also used to describe other young Café Society members like Brenda Frazier and Barbara Hutton. In 1938, 17-year-old Frazier was known as Glamour Girl Number 1 and appeared on the cover of Life magazine before her debutante ball. Readers also followed the troubled love life of Hutton, heiress to a $45 million Woolworth fortune, who married and divorced 2 European royals between 1933 and 1937. Her reaction to a 1939 Woolworth employee protest showed she never truly grasped the extent of her privilege as a Depression-era millionaire. "Why do they hate me?" she reportedly asked. "There are other girls just as rich, richer, almost as rich as I am." Enjoying swing and big band music on the radio, the most popular sound of the 1930s was a new type of music called swing. And the king of swing was clarinetist Benny Goodman. Benny Goodman, along with other musicians, made swing music incredibly popular in the 1930s. Swing was a new form of jazz. Many of the genre's earliest artists were black musicians in small, lesser-known groups. It wasn't until more prominent white musicians began playing swing in the mid-1930s that this new musical genre became extremely popular. One reason for swing music's popularity was the growing power of radio in the 1930s. Swing was a symbol of optimism, vitality, and adaptability during challenging times. Its lively rhythm, improvisational nature, and explosive energy brought joy and lifted the spirits of those struggling with economic burdens. Big bands, with their energetic performances, created a cultural phenomenon, helping people temporarily forget the harsh reality and immerse themselves in the music together. Witnessing goldfish swallowing and other bizarre contests. Dance marathons and flagpole sitting may have originated in the 1920s, but the Great Depression had its own truly bizarre and unique contest, goldfish swallowing. This craze began at Harvard University in 1939, when some students bet a freshman $10 that he couldn't swallow a live fish. On March 3rd, the freshman made good on his wager by chewing and swallowing a live goldfish in the dining hall in front of a group of students and a reporter. Life magazine reported on the story, and soon after, students at other universities began to try to see how many live goldfish they could swallow. In less than a month, the record jumped to 42 goldfish, swallowed by a member of the class of 1942. And by the end of April, the record was 101. This trend also inspired students to try swallowing other things. College students in Illinois swallowed 5 baby white mice. In Oregon, 139 live earthworms. Quirky contests like these reflected an aspect of the Great Depression spirit, the search for joy in the unusual, even the shocking. Enjoying government-funded art and theater. Among the unemployed during the Great Depression were many artists and performers of various kinds. Government programs to support these individuals led to the production of plays and artworks for everyone to enjoy. President Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal brought federal support to artists, with the view that artists have to eat too. The Works Progress Administration, WPA, hired muralists, writers, theater directors, and actors to continue providing entertainment for the country. The WPA also hired photographers and writers to document the lives of their fellow Americans. Among the products of this effort were oral histories that still inform the work of historians today. Thomas Benton painted workers, and others with strong, sturdy bodies. Edward Hopper showed the somber streets of American cities. Reginald Marsh painted scene after scene of the impoverished areas of New York City. The federal government created a job program for artists. They painted their works on the walls of airports, post offices, and schools. The program brought their ideas and creativity to millions. Going to see high-tech Hollywood movies, from talkies to dazzling musicals. Against the harsh backdrop of the Great Depression, Hollywood actually experienced a relatively successful decade, becoming a fortress of escapism for millions of Americans. Average movie tickets cost just under $0.25 throughout the 1930s, down from 35 cents in 1929. This made movie theaters an affordable form of entertainment, a place where people could temporarily forget their daily worries. This was a revolutionary period for cinema, as films fully transformed from silent films to talkies. Hollywood didn't hesitate to invest in new sound stages and film ideas that fully utilized this groundbreaking audio technology. The result was the birth of big-budget musicals with original songs, such as 42nd Street, 1933, and The Wizard of Oz, 1939. The spectacle of stunning synchronized dances and dazzling performances, choreographed by talented directors like Busby Berkeley, offered a powerful emotional release, helping viewers temporarily escape the gloomy reality. This decade also saw Walt Disney release the first feature-length animated film in history, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, 1937, a classic to this day. Audiences also flocked to see Marx Brothers comedies, screwball, romantic comedies, starring beloved stars like Katharine Hepburn and Cary Grant, or emotionally charged melodramas like A Star is Born, 1937. In fact, before Hollywood enforced the Hays Code in the summer of 1934 to keep films clean, viewers could even see Marlene Dietrich kiss a woman in Morocco, 1930, or Barbara Stanwyck rising to the top in Babyface, 1933. Although movie attendance did decline when the Great Depression began, the average weekly movie-going rate never dropped below 40%. Reading comics and complaining about their politics. Every Sunday, children across the country eagerly grabbed the newspaper to read the funny pages featuring the adventures of Detective Dick Tracy, Yale polo player Flash Gordon, and Little Orphan Annie, the plucky girl with surprisingly pro-business, anti-labor views. In a 1933 strip, Annie cheerfully exclaimed, "Gee, who says business is bad?" If Annie needed help on an adventure, she'd be rescued by Daddy Warbucks, a benevolent millionaire whose name hinted that he was a war profiteer. Annie's politics reflected the views of her creator, cartoonist Harold Gray. This popular comic strip made Gray incredibly wealthy. By 1934, he was earning $100,000 a year, nearly $2 million in 2019 dollars, since starting it in 1924. Angered by Franklin Delano Roosevelt's election in 1932, Gray used his strip to attack labor unions and the New Deal. The strip was popular with children for Annie's grand adventures, but not all adults enjoyed her politics. In 1935, the New Republic denounced Annie as fascism in the funnies. Reading comic strips was not only an affordable form of entertainment, but also a way for the public to access social and political commentary of the era. While children loved the adventures, adults could read into the implied, sometimes controversial, messages about the state of the nation. Engaging in sports. Sports played a crucial role in bringing joy and unity during the Great Depression, and baseball was the most popular sport in the 1930s. Going to a game wasn't too expensive, and kids playing baseball in the park was completely free. The most famous professional team of the era was the New York Yankees, with legendary players like Babe Ruth, Joe DiMaggio, and Lou Gehrig. These names weren't just sports stars. They were symbols of hope and excellence, bringing pride and inspiration to millions of fans. Besides baseball, Miniature golf was also a very popular trend in the early 1930s. It was a simple, low-cost form of entertainment, suitable for all ages, and didn't require much space or complex equipment. It brought joy through gentle competition and the ability to spend quality time with family and friends. College football also became very popular in this decade. Several new bowl games were introduced, including the Orange Bowl, Sun Bowl, Cotton Bowl, and Sugar Bowl. The prestigious Heisman Trophy was awarded for the first time in 1935, marking the sport's growth. Lining up to watch flagpole sitting, another endurance challenge from the 1920s that continued its popularity during the Great Depression, was flagpole sitting. That is, sitting atop a pole for as long as possible. The originator of this trend was a Hollywood stuntman named Alvin "Shipwreck" Kelly. In the summer of 1930, up to 20,000 people came to watch Kelly eat, sleep, and shave atop a 225-foot flagpole in Atlantic City for 49 days. That same summer, children across the country quickly took part in a tree-sitting challenge where they tried to stay in a tree for as long as possible. One teenager in Southern California reportedly lasted 1,320 hours, which is over 55 days. Like Kelly, these kids devised systems to bring food and other supplies up to their perches. Such activities became a curious symbol of the era, drawing public attention not only for their uniqueness, but also because they showcased an aspect of perseverance and effort which perfectly aligned with the spirit needed during tough economic times. Although the flagpole sitting craze largely subsided after that summer, it didn't disappear entirely. In 1933, Richard Dixie Blandy set a record of 77 days sitting atop a flagpole at the Chicago World's Fair. These bizarre endurance contests brought joy to viewers through curiosity and the sensation of witnessing something out of the ordinary. For the contestants, it was a way to stand out, perhaps earn a little money, or simply prove their endurance. Building a real estate empire in Monopoly. That a board game called Monopoly became popular during the Great Depression is ironic in itself, but it's even more ironic when considering the game's origin story. The game's inventor, Elizabeth J. Magie, first patented it in 1904 as landlord's game to teach players about the evils of capitalism. And for several decades, it did just that. However, in the 1930s, another man began selling a board game based on her idea. In 1935, he sold it to the struggling Parker Brothers Company, which then began selling it under the name Monopoly. The game was a huge success for families during the Great Depression because it was a relatively cheap form of entertainment that they could use repeatedly. Furthermore, it might have served as a form of wish fulfillment for those who knew they would never join cafe society. But it also erased Magie's role as the game's originator. So, while Parker Brothers made enough money from Monopoly to save itself from bankruptcy, Magie only earned $500 from Landlord's Game. The popularity of Monopoly during this period stemmed not only from its economical entertainment value, but also from its ability to allow players to imagine themselves as real estate magnates, controlling properties and accumulating wealth. A distant dream for most Americans at the time. Social dancing, jitterbug, and other styles. During the Great Depression, despite life's immense difficulties, social dancing remained one of the most popular and beloved forms of entertainment. Alongside the dramatic dance marathons, lively dances like the jitterbug had their golden age. Jitterbug, with its fast, energetic, and improvisational steps, became a symbol of vitality and joy. It was more than just a dance. It was a way to relieve stress, express energy, and connect socially in a free, exhilarating space. Literary historian Morris Dickstein wrote that, in the 1930s, movement was what art was most concerned with. He described that, in addition to conveying the wonderful joy and grace of movement, dance and film became a metaphor for the need of beleaguered people to connect and bond with one another, Although he referred to dance in film, this reflects a broader need for connection and energy that dancing provided in real life. Building and racing, soapbox cars. Soapbox derby races began in the 1930s as a competition for children that didn't require much money. In 1933, a journalist named Myron Scott noticed some kids in Dayton, Ohio, racing their homemade cars made from soapboxes. He photographed them and began helping them organize larger races. By the end of that summer, these races had attracted up to 40,000 spectators. The following year, Scott convinced Chevrolet to sponsor the first All-American Soapbox Derby for boys. Girls were not allowed to compete until 1971. After holding local races in the Midwest, 34 winners of those races came to Dayton to contend for the championship. The next year, the championship race moved to Akron, where it has been held ever since. Hundreds of thousands listened via radio to the 1936 All-American Soapbox Derby, held in Akron, Ohio. This was only the third year of the competition, but its popularity soared as America looked for something to cheer for while still grappling with the Great Depression. The All-American Soapbox Derby has been held annually in Akron ever since. This activity wasn't just a game. It was also a valuable lesson in ingenuity, engineering, and sportsmanship for children during tough times. It brought joy through healthy competition, creativity, and the ability to overcome challenges. For parents and communities, it was a meaningful event that brought people together, cheering alongside each other and witnessing the efforts of the next generation. Do you have any memories of playing simple DIY games or participating in similar community events from your childhood? Share them in the comments. Listening to diverse radio programs, comedy, mystery, adventure. Radio was a vital source of news and entertainment during the Great Depression. Throughout this decade, the number of American households owning a radio surged from about 40% to 83%. Each week, Americans gathered to follow masked superhero characters in The Lone Ranger and The Green Hornet, or laugh heartily with comedians like Gracie Allen and George Burns. One of the most famous sitcoms was Amos and Andy, a show criticized for being explicitly racist, which brought minstrelsy-style entertainment with blackface elements to the radio waves. Children especially loved listening to Dick Tracy and Little Orphan Annie, two programs inspired by popular comic strips, and sent in Quaker Oats box tops or Ovaltine seals to join each show's secret club. Americans also tuned into the radio for breaking news, the latest baseball scores, or the hottest Hollywood gossip. In 1933, President Franklin D. Roosevelt revolutionized the way presidents communicated with Americans by speaking directly to them over the radio. In his Fireside Chats, he discussed issues like the banking crisis, the New Deal, and the Dust Bowl. The Great Depression era was the golden age of radio. Radio proved it could be a significant force in both politics and popular culture. With the ingenuity of producers and the talent of actors, radio helped millions of Americans forget the difficult conditions of the Great Depression. Reading books and literature, escapism and social commentary. In the 1930s, most popular books were similar to Hollywood movies, primarily intended to help people forget their troubles rather than confront serious social issues. By doing so, authors also earned more money. This reflected the public's great need for escapism during difficult times, when a captivating story could provide comfort and temporarily pull them away from harsh reality. However, some writers in the 1930s produced books that were both profitable and high quality. One such writer was Sinclair Lewis. His book, It Can't Happen Here, warned of the impending dangers of fascism. John Steinbeck's great book, The Grapes of Wrath, helped millions understand and deeply feel the hardships faced by poor farmers. Erskine Caldwell wrote about the harshness of life for the poor in the southeastern United States, and James T. Farrell and Studs Terkel wrote about life in Chicago. Reading books, whether for entertainment or reflection, was a form of nourishing the soul amidst material scarcity. It helped people broaden their minds, discover new ideas, and feel less alone in their struggles. Accessing photography as an art form and documentation. Alongside the development of other art forms, photography also became more important as cameras improved in quality and became more compact and portable. Photographers like Margaret Bourke-White and Walker Evans used their cameras to record the harsh conditions of the Great Depression. Their photographs were not only historical records, but also haunting works of art, telling stories of poverty, resilience, and human dignity in adversity. Alfred Eisenstadt, a German immigrant, regularly had photographs of new events and celebrities on the covers of Life magazine. Alfred Stieglitz was another prominent photographer in the 1930s. He not only helped establish photography as an art form, but also had a major influence through his galleries in introducing pioneering artists from Europe to the public. The 1930s were a particularly productive period for landscape photographer Ansel Adams, who also turned to photographing factories and industrial subjects. Listening to classical music on the radio. Besides swing music, the 1930s also saw an increase in the popularity of traditional classical music by Mozart, Beethoven, Brahms, and other great composers. In 1930, the Columbia Broadcasting System began a series of New York Philharmonic concerts on Sunday afternoons. The following year, on Christmas Day, the National Broadcasting Company, NBC, began weekly opera broadcasts from the stage of the Metropolitan Opera House in New York. By 1937, NBC had invited Italy's Arturo Toscanini to conduct an orchestra on American radio. Toscanini was the greatest conductor of his time. Millions of Americans tuned in on Christmas Eve as Toscanini and the NBC Orchestra began playing the first of 10 special radio concerts. This was a wonderful moment for both music and radio. For the first time, millions of ordinary Americans could hear classical music by great composers as it was being performed live. What do you think is most important for art and entertainment forms to endure through difficult periods of history? Let us know in the comments below. Exploring haunted houses. The Halloween traditions we know today, including trick-or-treating, costume parties, and haunted houses, really began to flourish during the Great Depression as a way to keep young people out of trouble. October 31st had long been a night for mischief. However, after a particularly bad Halloween in 1933, when hundreds of teenagers across the country overturned cars, sawed down telephone poles, and committed other acts of vandalism, many communities began organizing Halloween events for children and teenagers to prevent this kind of destruction. Parents tapped into their creativity to create spooky haunted houses without spending a lot of money. A 1937 party handbook offered advice on how to create a path of horrors. Hang old furs, strips of raw liver on the walls, where people have to grope their way to dark stairs. Eerie sounds like groans and howls emanated from dark corners, and damp sponges and hairnets hung from the ceiling, brushing against passers-by. Entrances were blocked, forcing guests to crawl through a long, dark tunnel. These homemade haunted houses not only brought joy and excitement to children, but also created opportunities for families and communities to collaborate, using their ingenuity and imagination during a time of scarce resources. It clearly demonstrated the spirit of making do with what you have, or making something old new again, creatively reusing materials to create fun. For our older viewers, the image of parents back then doing their utmost to bring joy to their children in difficult circumstances will surely evoke deep emotions about family values and resilience. At-home hames and DIY activities. When money was tight and going out for entertainment became a luxury, American families turned to at-home entertainment methods, often DIY activities or simple, inexpensive games. The phrase, "desperate times call for creative measures," became a guiding principle for many families. Their ingenuity and imagination were put to full use to create joy from what they had on hand. A prime example is how parents used their creativity to create spooky haunted houses without much expense, as mentioned earlier. They utilized items readily available at home or easily found to create play spaces for their children. This wasn't limited to Halloween. Families could play board games together, beyond Monopoly, which was mentioned, solve puzzles, or even tell stories. Evenings spent together, playing a simple game or creating something as a family, became cherished moments. Attending fairs and expositions. While not daily entertainment, these events held great significance in boosting morale and showcasing national progress. A prime example is the 1933 Chicago World's Fair, also known as a Century of Progress. Here, Richard Dixie Blandy set a record of 77 days sitting atop a flagpole, drawing the attention of thousands. Though just one of many attractions, this event illustrated how fairs were hubs for unique and unusual activities to draw audiences. Large fairs often showcased scientific, technological, and artistic achievements, offering an optimistic view of the future amidst challenging current circumstances. They were places where people could marvel at new things, participate in games and activities, enjoy food, and experience a festive atmosphere. Among the forms of entertainment we've just explored, which one impresses you the most about the resilience and optimism of Americans during the Great Depression? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Community events and public gatherings for entertainment. Beyond individual or family entertainment, community events and public gatherings played a crucial role in bringing joy and strengthening unity for Americans during the Great Depression. When personal resources were limited, sharing collective experiences became incredibly meaningful. These events not only provided safe fun, but also created a space for neighbors and friends to participate together, laugh together, and feel the warmth of their community. Similarly, the soapbox derby races, though for children, attracted tens of thousands of spectators, turning them into major community events. People flocked to cheer, to witness the children's efforts, and to share in the pride of their community. The Great Depression was a challenging chapter in American history, but as we've seen, it was also a period where imagination, resilience, and the human spirit rose strong. From dramatic dance marathons to glittering Hollywood films, from classic baseball games to politically charged comic strip stories, Americans proved that joy and hope could be found even in the darkest circumstances. We hope you had an emotional journey into the past with us. If you enjoyed this journey, don't forget to like, subscribe to Who Remember, and share this video with friends and family, especially those who lived through those memorable decades. Thank you for watching, and see you on our next historical exploration.